London, April 1963. A politician opens his morning newspaper and sees his career ending on the front page. Photographs of himself and a woman leaving a hotel. Headlines screaming about betrayal and broken vows. His hands are shaking. His secretary will not meet his eyes. The man in those photographs sat on a committee with access to Britain's nuclear deterrent strategy. MI6 believed he was passing information to Moscow. They could not prove it. They could not prosecute him. They could not allow him to continue. What he did not know was that the woman in the photographs was an MI6 operative. The affair was staged from the first introduction to the final embrace. The hotel was selected for its camera angles. Every moment of intimacy was manufactured to produce evidence that would destroy him. He thought he had fallen in love. She thought she was serving her country. The photographs captured something that was never real. This is the story of how MI6 weaponized a scandal to eliminate a threat they could not touch any other way. Britain in 1962 faced threats that could not be addressed through conventional means. The Cold War had reached its most dangerous moment. Cuba brought the world to the edge of nuclear annihilation. Berlin remained a flashpoint where miscalculation could trigger catastrophe. In this environment, security was not an abstraction. It was survival. Within Parliament sat men whose loyalties were uncertain. Not spies in the traditional sense. Not agents receiving payments in dead drops, or photographing documents in locked offices. Something more ambiguous, and therefore more dangerous. Sympathizers whose beliefs aligned with Moscow and whose positions gave them access to information that should never reach Soviet hands. Richard Haldane was a Labour MP representing an industrial constituency in the Midlands. He'd served in Parliament for 12 years. He sat on the Defence Select Committee, where he received briefings on nuclear strategy, NATO force positioning, and intelligence assessments of Soviet military capabilities. He knew things that Moscow would pay dearly to learn. MI5 had monitored him for years. They documented meetings with known Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover. Haldane described these encounters as professional courtesy between parliamentarians and foreign officials. MI5 saw something else entirely. They recorded conversations where he expressed views indistinguishable from positions published in Pravda. They tracked patterns of contact that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. They built a file that pointed toward collaboration, but proved nothing that would survive legal scrutiny. The problem was evidence. Haldane was careful in ways that suggested training or natural caution. He never accepted payments that could be traced. He never removed documents that could be photographed. If he passed information to his Soviet contacts, he did so verbally in social settings, where recording was impossible. His meetings occurred at receptions and dinners, where conversation with foreign diplomats was expected and unremarkable. Prosecution was impossible without evidence that did not exist. The political consequences of accusing a sitting MP based on suspicion and circumstantial patterns would be catastrophic. The case would collapse. The government would be embarrassed. Haldane would emerge vindicated and more dangerous than before. But leaving him in place was unacceptable. Every month he retained committee access was another month of potential leaks. Another month of Soviet insight into British nuclear planning. Another month of risk that could not be quantified, but could not be ignored. MI6 concluded that Richard Haldane needed to be removed from public life through means that required no courtroom and no evidence. If they could not send him to prison, they would send him somewhere equally permanent. Disgrace. Destroying Richard Haldane required understanding what made him vulnerable. Richard Haldane was born in 1919 to a family that valued intellect above all else. His father taught medieval history at Oxford and published books that were admired by dozens of people. His mother wrote poetry that appeared in journals nobody read. He grew up surrounded by ideas and arguments and the unspoken assumption that intelligence conferred moral authority over those less gifted. He came of age during the Depression, watching capitalism collapse while newspapers reported Soviet industrial triumph. The contrast shaped him permanently. Unemployment lines stretched through British cities, while the Soviet Union claimed full employment and 5-year plans that exceeded targets. Like many of his generation, he found in Marxism answers that liberalism could not provide. He joined leftist groups at Cambridge. He attended meetings where revolution was discussed as historical inevitability. He believed history was moving toward a destination, and that destination was socialist. The war complicated his politics without fundamentally changing them. He served in military intelligence, where he developed skills in analysis and compartmentalization that would serve him throughout his career. He emerged from the conflict convinced that the real enemy had never been Germany. Fascism was merely a symptom of the capitalist system that had produced it. The Soviet Union, whatever its flaws, represented humanity's future. He entered Parliament in 1950, winning a safe Labour seat vacated by a retiring member. His intellect impressed colleagues who valued thoughtfulness over passion. His discretion reassured party leaders worried about ideological firebrands who might embarrass them in the press. He rose steadily through committee assignments, gaining access to increasingly sensitive material while maintaining the measured public profile of a serious parliamentarian. His personal life proved less successful. A marriage in 1952 to a woman from a similar academic family produced 2 children and mutual disappointment that calcified into permanent distance. His wife retreated to their house in Oxfordshire. He remained in London, absorbed by politics and surrounded by loneliness he refused to acknowledge. MI6 identified multiple vulnerabilities during their assessment. He was isolated in ways that created hunger for connection. He was idealistic in ways that made him susceptible to anyone who engaged seriously with his beliefs. He responded to attention from women who treated his ideas as worthy of discussion rather than tolerance. Most importantly, he was vain. He believed his intelligence elevated him above ordinary constraints. Rules that applied to lesser men did not apply to him. He had spent decades being the smartest person in rooms full of smart people. He had never learned to question his own judgment. That vanity would be his destruction. MI6 needed an operative who could exploit those vulnerabilities without triggering his well-developed suspicion. The decision to destroy Haldane through scandal was not made lightly. Senior officers debated alternatives for weeks before concluding that no other method would work. Prosecution required evidence that did not exist. Diplomatic pressure required leverage they did not possess. Assassination would solve the immediate problem, but create others far worse. What remained was social destruction. A method that required no courtroom, left no fingerprints, and achieved permanent removal from public life. The justification was consequence rather than proof. Every day Haldane retained access to nuclear policy was a day that information might reach Moscow. The committee briefings he attended covered targeting doctrine, warhead deployments, and NATO contingency planning. If even a fraction of that material reached Soviet intelligence, the strategic implications were severe. The potential damage outweighed the certain destruction of one man's life. Or so, the officers who approved the operation told themselves. The method was chosen for deniability above all else. A sex scandal required no visible involvement from intelligence services. Newspapers would publish the photographs. Editors would write the headlines. The public would draw conclusions without prompting. Haldane's own party would demand his resignation to limit political damage. MI6 would remain invisible throughout. The operative selected for the assignment was a woman named Catherine Beaumont, 31 years old. Educated at Oxford, where she read modern languages. She had worked for MI6 for 6 years in roles requiring sustained cover and psychological manipulation. She understood how to make men trust her. She understood how to maintain emotional distance while performing intimacy. She had done similar work before, though never with objectives this final. Catherine's briefing was explicit about what was required. She would manufacture a romantic relationship with Richard Haldane over approximately 6 months. She would engineer situations that could be photographed by surveillance teams. She would build a documented record of an affair that would end his career, his marriage, and his public reputation when released to the press. She would make him fall in love with her. Then she would destroy him, using that love as the weapon. The timeline allowed for careful development. 6 months was long enough to build genuine emotional connection, short enough to limit operational exposure and the psychological toll on the operative. Catherine accepted the assignment with the professional detachment she brought to every operation. She did not ask whether Haldane deserved what was coming. Guilt or innocence was not her concern. She had been given an objective. She would achieve it. The approach required patience and precision that only months of preparation could provide. The introduction was engineered to appear accidental. A reception at the Soviet embassy in October 1962, during the worst days of the Cuban crisis. The kind of event Haldane attended regularly, despite the optics. Catherine appeared as a junior researcher at a foreign policy institute that MI6 had established years earlier as cover for various operations. Her presence at such a gathering was entirely natural for someone in her supposed position. She positioned herself near conversations Haldane joined throughout the evening. She offered opinions that were intelligent but deferential. She disagreed with him on minor points, just enough to seem independent. While agreeing on matters he considered important, she made him feel that his views had found a worthy audience. He noticed her. That was the point. Their first substantial conversation lasted nearly an hour. Catherine asked questions about his committee work that flattered his sense of importance, without crossing into territory that might trigger caution. She expressed views on disarmament that aligned precisely with positions he had advocated for years. She quoted from an article he had written in 1958, as though she had discovered it independently and found it persuasive. She made him feel understood by someone worth impressing. The follow-up contacts were gradual and carefully spaced. A letter thanking him for the conversation and asking a question that invited response. An invitation to speak at her institute on a topic he cared about. Coffee after his lecture to discuss points he had raised. Each interaction was calibrated to build connection without appearing aggressive or desperate. By December, they were meeting weekly. He told himself the relationship was intellectual. A younger colleague who valued his mentorship and engaged seriously with ideas his own wife had stopped pretending to find interesting decades ago. He did not acknowledge what he actually felt, because acknowledging it would require examining implications he preferred to avoid. Catherine played her role with precision that came from training and natural talent. She admired his mind openly. She sought his guidance on her own work. She created dependence through sustained attention of a kind his marriage had never provided. She never initiated physical contact. She let him believe that every escalation was his own idea, his own desire asserting itself against his own judgment. By February, the relationship had crossed from professional to personal in ways that could no longer be denied. He touched her hand during conversations and let his fingers linger. He suggested dinners rather than coffee, restaurants rather than his office. He began speaking of his marriage with the dissatisfaction of a man constructing justifications for what he intended to do next. Catherine reported every development to her handlers through dead drops and brief meetings in public spaces. The emotional progression was documented in detail. The target was proceeding along the anticipated trajectory. The operation was unfolding exactly as designed. She did not allow herself to think about what would happen when it ended. She did not consider what 6 months of performed intimacy would do to a man who believed it was real. That was not her job. Her job was to make him love her. She was succeeding. The affair needed to become physical before it could become evidence. The physical relationship began in March 1963. Haldane initiated it, as Catherine had known he would. Months of emotional intimacy had created pressure that demanded release. She responded with enthusiasm, calibrated to encourage without overwhelming. She made him feel desired in ways his marriage had never achieved. She performed passion convincingly enough that she sometimes wondered where performance ended and something else began. The hotel was selected by MI6 months before the first visit. a discreet establishment in Bayswater that catered to clients who valued privacy. Politicians conducted sensitive meetings there. Businessmen met mistresses. The staff asked no questions and remembered no faces. Rooms on the third floor offered sightlines, accessible from a building across the narrow street. Photographers could work from those windows without detection. Catherine suggested the location during a conversation about where they might meet privately. A friend had recommended it. Discreet, comfortable, no chance of encountering anyone who might recognize them. Haldane accepted without suspicion. He was too consumed by anticipation to question the convenience of her suggestion. Over 6 weeks, they met at the hotel 11 times. Each visit was documented by photographers positioned in the building opposite. Arrivals captured through telephoto lenses. Departures recorded with timestamps that proved duration. Embraces visible through windows when curtains were positioned to allow partial sight lines. Catherine ensured the curtains were never fully closed. She created opportunities for the cameras without ever appearing to do so. Haldane fell deeper with each encounter. He spoke of leaving his wife. He imagined a future where he and Catherine lived openly together. He shared confidences about his committee work that confirmed everything MI6 had suspected about his willingness to discuss sensitive matters with people he trusted. She memorized every detail, but the photographs remained the primary objective. He told her he loved her on their 8th meeting. She said the words back to him. They felt strange in her mouth. She had spoken them before on other operations. They had never felt quite so much like a weapon being loaded. By early April, MI6 determined they had sufficient evidence, images that could not be misinterpreted, a narrative that would write itself when the photographs reached editors. A married politician, a younger woman, a hotel room, 11 visits over 6 weeks. The story required no elaboration. The operation entered its final phase. The photographs needed to reach the right hands at the right moment. The leak was orchestrated through intermediaries who could never be traced to MI6. A brown envelope appeared on the desk of a tabloid journalist known for political scandals. No return address. No accompanying letter. Just photographs and a single typed sheet identifying the man in the images as Richard Haldane, Member of Parliament, married father of 2, member of the Defence Select Committee. The journalist recognized the gift for what it was. Someone wanted Haldane destroyed and had provided the ammunition. He did not question the source. In his profession, anonymous tips were currency. The story mattered more than its origin. The newspaper verified what verification was possible. The man in the photographs was unmistakably Haldane. Staff confirmed his identity against file images from political coverage. The hotel existed at the address visible in some frames. The woman could not be identified, which made the story better rather than worse. A mystery lover. The public would speculate endlessly about her identity. The editor made one telephone call before authorizing publication. Not to Haldane for comment, but to a contact in government who could confirm the story would not be suppressed on national security grounds. The contact, who reported to MI6 through channels the editor never suspected, confirmed that no intervention would occur. The story could run. Publication came on April 17, 1963. Front page above the fold. Photographs of Haldane entering and leaving the hotel on different dates. A woman's silhouette visible in one frame. Her face obscured, but her presence unmistakable. Headlines stopped just short of explicit accusation, while making the implications impossible to miss. The text invited readers to draw their own conclusions about a married parliamentarian visiting the same hotel repeatedly in the company of a woman who was not his wife. Haldane learned of the publication when his secretary placed the newspaper on his desk at 7:30 in the morning. She would not meet his eyes. He stared at the photographs for several minutes without speaking. His hands trembled. His career was ending, and he did not yet understand how or why. He tried to telephone Catherine. The number he had called dozens of times connected to a tone indicating disconnection. He tried the institute, where she supposedly worked. The receptionist informed him that no one by that name had ever been employed there. He asked her to check again. She checked. The answer did not change. The realization arrived slowly, and then all at once. The woman he loved did not exist. The affair that had felt like the most genuine connection of his life had been manufactured from nothing. Someone had done this to him deliberately and methodically over months. He never discovered who. He suspected Soviet intelligence, believing Moscow had turned against him for reasons beyond his understanding. The possibility that British intelligence had orchestrated his destruction never occurred to him. He could not imagine his own country doing such a thing to one of its own. His resignation from the committee was requested and received within 48 hours. Party leadership made clear that continued membership in Parliament was untenable. His constituency association informed him they would not support his candidacy at the next election. His wife filed for divorce before April ended. She took the children to her family's home and refused all contact. By May, Richard Haldane had lost everything: his position, his reputation, his family, his understanding of how the world operated. The photographs that destroyed him captured moments with a woman who had never been real. Catherine Beaumont received a commendation that was filed in records no one outside MI6 would ever see. She requested transfer to a section that did not involve honey trap operations. The request was granted without discussion. She never ran another operation like this one. The man who had posed an unacceptable risk was gone. The question was what his removal had actually achieved. Richard Haldane retreated from public life completely. He sold his London flat within weeks of the scandal breaking. He sold his share of the Oxfordshire house to his wife as part of the divorce settlement. He purchased a small cottage in a Welsh village where nobody knew his name or cared about British politics. He disappeared as thoroughly as if he had died. MI5 surveillance continued for 2 years after his removal from Parliament. Officers monitored his correspondence and tracked his occasional travels. They found nothing of interest. He had no access left to provide. He maintained no contacts worth watching. He was a broken man living in isolation, writing letters that nobody answered, and reading books about a political world that had expelled him. The Soviet contacts who had valued his insights found new sources. The intelligence channel MI6 believed had existed was never definitively proven. Haldane's removal was justified by potential damage rather than documented betrayal. The threat had been assessed, not demonstrated. The destruction had been certain. The danger had been theoretical. His children refused contact for over a decade. His son eventually relented and visited twice in the late 1970s. The conversations were strained. His daughter never forgave him for the humiliation he had brought upon the family. She learned of his death through a solicitor's letter. His ex-wife remarried in 1965 to a man who shared none of her first husband's intellectual pretensions. She never spoke of Haldane publicly. When journalists occasionally sought her comment on anniversaries of the scandal, she declined through intermediaries. Haldane wrote a memoir in 1971 that blamed political enemies for his downfall, without ever identifying who those enemies might be. The book sold fewer than 3,000 copies. Reviewers described it as self-pitying and evasive. Nobody wanted to read the justifications of a disgraced politician relitigating a scandal everyone had already forgotten. He died in 1984 in his Welsh cottage. A neighbour found him after milk bottles accumulated on the doorstep. The obituaries were brief and focused almost entirely on the scandal rather than his years of parliamentary service. He was remembered for how he fell, rather than what he had built. Catherine Beaumont resigned from MI6 in 1968. She married an academic who knew nothing of her previous career and raised 2 children in comfortable anonymity. She never spoke of the Haldane operation to anyone outside the intelligence community. When asked years later by a former colleague whether she had any regrets, she considered the question for a long moment before declining to answer. The removal of Richard Haldane from the Defence Select Committee closed an access point that MI6 believed was leaking information to Moscow. In the months following his disgrace, the suspected intelligence channel went silent. Soviet operational planning showed reduced accuracy regarding British nuclear posture. Whether this resulted from Haldane's removal or coincidental factors was never established with certainty. The correlation was noted. Causation remained unproven. The operation demonstrated capability that served deterrent purposes beyond the immediate objective. Within intelligence circles, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, the message spread through channels that such messages travel. Sympathizers with access could be neutralized through means that required no prosecution and no evidence. The threat facing potential collaborators was not imprisonment. It was annihilation. Career destroyed. Family lost. Reputation erased. Everything a man had built over decades reduced to tabloid headlines and public shame. Other politicians with questionable associations became measurably more cautious in the years following Haldane's fall. MI5 surveillance files documented reduced contact with Soviet officials across multiple subjects of ongoing interest. Men who had previously attended embassy receptions without concern began declining invitations. Conversations that had been conducted openly moved to more guarded registers or ceased entirely. The fear of exposure proved more effective than any security briefing. The methodology was used sparingly in subsequent decades. Honey traps remained tools of last resort, deployed only when other options had failed, and when the assessed risk justified the ethical cost. The Haldane operation established both the template and the boundaries. MI6 never acknowledged involvement. Officially, Richard Haldane's career ended because of personal indiscretions discovered by journalists doing their jobs. The intelligence service's role remained invisible then and remains officially unconfirmed today. One man's destruction had removed a security risk and sent a message that echoed for years. By operational metrics, the mission was successful. Yet, the operation raises questions that resist easy answers. MI6 destroyed a man's life based on suspicion rather than proof. Richard Haldane was never charged with any crime. He was never given the opportunity to defend himself against accusations. He was never shown the evidence that justified his destruction. He was simply erased from public life through manufactured scandal, condemned by photographs of an affair that had been engineered specifically to produce those photographs. The case against him was circumstantial. He held opinions that were unpopular in Western capitals. He met with people his government distrusted. He may have passed information to Moscow, or he may have been nothing more than a naive idealist who believed dialogue served peace better than confrontation. The files that might resolve the question remain classified. Catherine Beaumont made him fall in love with someone who did not exist. She exploited loneliness and vanity to create evidence of behavior that was itself manufactured. The affair was real only in his experience of it. For her, every kiss was operational. Every whispered intimacy was tradecraft. The love he felt was genuine. The love she performed was a weapon. The utilitarian calculation favors the outcome if you accept the premise. One man's destruction weighed against potential damage to national security. But the premise was never proven. The damage was assumed. The destruction was certain. Was Richard Haldane a traitor who deserved what he received? Or was he a man destroyed by suspicion that never rose to proof? Justice requires evidence. Intelligence sometimes cannot wait for evidence. The space between those truths is where operations like this live. Somewhere in Wales, a forgotten grave holds a man who loved a woman who never existed. Whether he deserved his fate depends on secrets that may never be revealed.